During the Tudor period, there were dozens of people who were led on the short walk out of the gatehouse of the Tower of London, north to a hill, a grassy area, where a huge crowd had been gathered. The flocks of thousands were there to see executions, and some of the most famous people of the Tudor period lost their heads on the scaffold, which was known as London's public beheading spot. Tower Hill today is dwarfed by skyscrapers and huge buildings that make London and the City of London the modern-day metropolis that it is. But in the centuries before, it was where blood was shed on a regular basis, and during the reigns of some of the most notorious kings and queens, the executioner's axe came crashing onto the necks of the victims. Today we look at Tower Hill and see whether it was one of the most brutal execution sites in history. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Most people believe that a huge amount of execution took place throughout the years, actually inside the Tower of London, but this is actually not the case. There were a couple of dozen executions that occurred at the Tower, but the Tower of London was reserved as an execution spot for members of royalty and those who were of incredible importance and nobility. The majority of the people throughout the centuries were executed in this area of London on Tower Hill. Usually people would be locked up inside of the tower and then brought out for their trial before being sent back into the tower to await their death sentence. Preparations would then be made for the executions, and on the day of the execution proceeding, the condemned criminal would be led out onto the walk north to Tower Hill, flanked by guards in front of thousands of people. It would have been a rather humiliating experience for the condemned person, as they were expected to solemnly proceed to the executioner on the scaffold who was waiting for them. It was mostly execution by axe that took place on Tower Hill. However, there have been accounts of some who were hanged, drawn and quartered there, or even burned on Tower Hill or the area around. Today one execution, axe and block, which was used allegedly for the final beheading on Tower Hill, that of Lord Lovat, is inside the Tower of London's exhibition, and still on the oak block are the cut marks where the axe came crashing down on Lovat's neck. Executions took place on Tower Hill, as it was a large public space where huge crowds could gather and see the King or Queen's justice being enacted and carried out. It was a sign of the power of the monarchy, and also served as a warning to many people not to commit serious crimes. Many people on Tower Hill lost their heads for the most serious crime of treason, and after the executions the heads would then be collected and taken down to London Bridge nearby. The head would be passed on to the keeper of the heads, the man who was responsible for displaying the executed heads high above the gatehouse of London Bridge, where many people every day would pass under. The scaffold of Tower Hill was large and big enough for everyone to get a relatively decent view. There were also stands put up for people to sit on, and pay to get a better seat for the execution. Sometimes these were so busy that there were incidents where the stands collapsed and many people were injured. Often vendors also sold snacks and drinks to try and make some money, and some local people even rented out their windows for people to peer outside at the execution at. Some of the most prominent people in England throughout the years would lose their heads at Tower Hill. In 1381, during the Peasants' Revolt, Simon Sudbury, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who was a target of the rebels and the angry mob, was dragged from the Tower of London to Tower Hill, where his head was hacked off from his body. This was England's most senior churchman being executed in front of the crowd. Others were executed here by the Plantagenet kings, including the 12th Earl of Oxford in 1462. It was during the reign of the Tudors that lots of executions were happening on the hill. Henry VIII marked the beginning of his reign by bringing the axe down upon the necks of two of his father's friends and most unpopular advisers and governors, Edmund Dudley and Sir Richard Empson. These were both responsible for many of the harsh tax increases in England and were very unpopular, and with their executions Henry VIII gained a lot of popularity himself. Henry continued to take people's heads off on Tower Hill. In 1521, Edward Stafford, the 3rd Duke of Buckingham, lost his head, and then following his changes to the church and marital issues, Henry continued to have people condemned to death on a very regular basis. John Fisher, a very popular churchman, was dragged out to Tower Hill, and on the scaffold, the Bishop of Rochester approached it with courage. He was beheaded by an axeman with one swing, and the crowd who witnessed the execution were horrified with seeing the elderly man's treatment. Fisher's execution did not help Henry VIII's popularity, and Fisher's body was treated terribly, and was on the king's orders left and stripped on the scaffold for many hours, and it was then on pikes dumped in a rough grave in the nearby churchyard of All Hallows by the Tower, which is the closest church to Tower Hill. His head was then stuck on a pole above London Bridge. Weeks later his head was replaced by one of his friends, Sir Thomas More, Henry VIII's Lord Chancellor, and a man of immense talent and skill. More could not support Henry VIII's marriage to Anne Boleyn and his church reforms, and with this he was sent to Tower Hill after much protest. It's probable that the king did not want to go through with More's execution, but he did this to make a statement. Anne Boleyn's brother George was also a victim of the axe there in 1536, accused of incest with the Queen, his sister, and Henry VIII's closest adviser and friend Thomas Cromwell would also lose his head, and this was an execution that Henry VIII certainly regretted. Throughout the subsequent reigns of the other Tudor monarchs there were more executions, as the husband of Lady Jane Grey, the 9-day Queen, was condemned, and others including the Lord Protector, Edward Seymour, and his brother Thomas, lost their lives. It was in the following century that two of the worst executions in British history occurred at Tower Hill. The executioner who performed Lord Russell and the Duke of Monmouth's death was Jack Ketch, a man whose name in history has gone down in infamy for his botching work. Ketch took many swings of the axe to take the heads off Lord Russell and Monmouth, who was the illegitimate son of King Charles II, allegedly broke Ketch's composure, and the executioner even gave up at one point. Ketch's work that day upset the crowd so much that a riot almost broke out, and people tried to grab Ketch, the executioner, to take his head off next. The people of Tower Hill expected executions to be carried out in a very specific manner. They wanted to see the head of someone come off cleanly, and they expected the executioner to use his skill to do this. Usually the victims would hand over a small bag of coins or some jewellery to the executioner beforehand, almost like a bribe to ensure their head was taken off in one clean blow. Some executioners who worked on Tower Hill were not the most skilled with the axe, and were more adept at using the gallows and a noose, and they would travel around the different execution sites in London for the job. That's why Ketch was probably so botching. He was an acceptable hangman, but a poor axeman. The final execution to have taken place at Tower Hill was that of Simon Fraser, the 11th Lord Lovat. Lovat was a Scottish Jacobite and a chief of Clan Fraser of Lovat, and during the Jacobite uprising he took the side of the rebels, and following his capture he was taken to London and was tried in front of the House of Lords. It's believed that the executioner's axe and block inside the Tower of London today was the one used upon Fraser's neck. He made his way up to Tower Hill and was dispatched, probably with 2 strikes of the axe, based on the fact there are 2 strike marks on the block within the tower today. Today thousands of people each day enter the tube station at Tower Hill, and they pass by the former site of the scaffold, which is marked by a memorial inside of a garden. It was here where in the years before hundreds of people lost their heads, and thousands of people witnessed what happened to them. As mentioned, it was primarily the axe which was used here for executions, but this was one of the most brutal and ruthless execution methods deployed in Britain, but was considered a quick and rather sparing death if the executioner knew what he was doing with the axe. There were accounts during the centuries where this did not happen upon Tower Hill, making it one of history's and England's most brutal execution sites. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.